We're gonna get into sports-specific endurance training, and we're gonna start right now. One of the biggest factors that I've learned from helping athletes get to the Olympics, from helping athletes qualify for world championships, to get to the NFL, to develop themselves as NCAA All-American state champions and anything along that realm, is that oftentimes we have struggled to really cater to individuals with endurance-based training for their specific sport. Okay, and so when we're looking at specific sports, I think it's important to think through, like, should we be training someone like a shot putter the same way that we would be training someone like a marathoner or an endurance swimmer or an ultra marathoner or an ultra cyclist, something along those lines. And so when we start this journey, we can sort of work backwards and really start to think through what are the issues. And oftentimes, one of the biggest things that I've experienced, that I've gone through, is that there's a ton of research out there. And so there's information there. You can go to PubMed and you just have tons of research at your fingertips. And you can read through every single paper. You can listen to podcasts from Andrew Huberman and Peter Attia and Andy Galpin and really dive into some impressive knowledge and impressive data, but then we struggle to have some type of practical input or some type of practical training system. So we have this access, we have crazy amounts of resources, but we still struggle to then apply it personally or apply it to ourselves or apply it to our athletes. And I think that even when we look at this deeper, especially in the realm of, let's say, social media, it becomes very challenging to study research, think through how we can apply it, then we're swiping and we're scrolling and we're thinking about this Bosu ball exercise looks neat, or this ab exercise looks challenging, or hanging weights this way looks cool, or doing chain back squats, whatever. All of these things sort of feed into our goldfish brain, and then we struggle to still apply things because we've got all these different thoughts and all these different ideas and all these different modalities that we think we have to be applying because they look cool. Okay, so then when we come back to endurance training, we come back and we don't have like a very specific idea of implementation. Instead, we have a more broad stroke on everything. And in some senses, it's okay to have that broad stroke. In some senses, especially with earlier training with athletes, it's okay to be more general. In fact, I actually think it's more beneficial to have more generalized training, especially with younger athletes. But that takes us into some of the other aspects. And so one of the big things that I wanted to go through is when we pose that question, especially in the realm of strength and conditioning, and if we look at the background of strength coaches, right? So we're looking at ourselves and we're going, okay, in all reality, the way that we train individuals, okay, so the way that we'll train a soccer player and the way that we'll train a wrestler and the way that we'll train even somebody who runs cross country is probably going to be based off of two things, okay? So how did we train growing up? Okay, how did we train growing up? What were the systems that we went through as an athlete? In my case, I will use this as an example. I was a power athlete. I was a shot putter. I was a wrestler. I was a football player. My training was done by a strength coach who taught me how to snatch, who taught me how to clean, who taught me how to back squat, front squat, do all these things, run sprints, do plyometrics, okay? That was the system I grew up in. And what that taught me was that that system was pretty dang effective. I was pretty explosive. I was pretty fast. I was pretty athletic. I went on and became a Power 5 shot putter. Now, the downfall is that I was successful, so everything, not necessarily a downfall, but everything from an early point in my career was through this lens, okay? It was done through that lens of success. And so as a strength coach, you have one of two roads that you typically carry early on, right? And so we'll go through this and we'll develop a system of training that's going to be very strength-based. Okay, so you're either going to be typically in weightlifting, or you're going to be someone who's more powerlifting based, sometimes bodybuilding based in there as well. And you will follow that road based off of whether or not you were successful or not successful. Okay, so if you were successful, you go the route that you were trained as an athlete. If you were unsuccessful as an athlete, but you still liked physical performance, you sort of go the opposite route because this route didn't work for you. So if you were in a weightlifting background, but you weren't that athletic or you weren't that successful as an athlete, you sort of back off and go the other route. What ends up happening is that we sort of get pigeonholed into, okay, this is how things were done for me. This is, success or not success. And therefore, this is how I have to do things moving forward. And so a lot of us, weightlifting, powerlifting, bodybuilding, tend to be super strength based. Okay, we are constantly in the weight room. We love squatting, we love benching, we love doing pull-ups, we love all the things that are resistance based. But what ends up occurring then is that we struggle with these questions of, what if a shot putter needs more endurance? What does that look like? What if a marathoner comes to us and they want to focus on becoming a better marathoner? Should we just have them squat more because that's what we did as an athlete, or should we start to think through the lens of their specific sport? And then even going deeper, you start to look at a sport like soccer or lacrosse and you go, okay, this athlete comes in and trains with us. How can we improve their speed, or how can we improve their endurance, or how can we improve their strength or their explosiveness? And then what does that look like from a training perspective? This comes back to a lot of the information that I learned from training with Dr. Anatoly Bondarchuk, who was an Olympic champion. He trained multiple different Olympic champions. And what ended up happening is that when I went and trained with Dr. Bondarchuk, I learned about sport specificity, okay? And now, some of you might be getting triggered, but I think we've got to look through that lens of sport specificity is not doing a one-arm Bosu ball press and saying that this is, specific for a shot putter. Instead, it was doing things like a half turn with a dumbbell and throw a dumbbell, okay? Throw a cinder block, like hardcore sport-specific stuff. Okay, so I did want to throw that out there. But then over time, because I was still in that mindset of just doing exactly what I did growing up, when I started to train more wrestlers and when I personally started to get into marathon training, I started to really think through a couple different questions. I started to really figure out what I should be doing or what I was missing actually in my training system. And that's where the endurance aspect comes in, is that we have a lot of wrestlers, we have a lot of distance runners. Myself was training to run a marathon, and I started to realize I don't know a lot about endurance training. Then I'm even looking at past athletes that I've worked with that have endurance in their entire training system. And that was somebody like Hugo Barrett, who was a two-time Olympian in sprint cycling. Someone like Margot Gear, who was a world champion in swimming and a Pan Am Games champion. And then getting into athletes in Olympic weightlifting, athletes in the NFL who needed endurance-based work. And then even getting into snowboarders and canoers that we work with who do indeed need some sense of endurance. And so I had to get rid of and throw out these beliefs that I had around endurance training. And so I wanted to share 7 of these beliefs and then really start to lead into how we can break these, how we can move forward, how we can understand the physiology around endurance, and then really build out a training system that's going to have that big picture macro system, and then mine even deeper into those specific workouts. So what are some of those endurance misconceptions? And I think this even goes into, my favorite philosopher Confucius says, the man who asks a question is a fool for a minute. The man who does not ask is a fool for their entire life. And I think that this quote is something that I really took to heart when trying to figure out the endurance component of wrestling, of swimming, of sprint cycling, of running a marathon, was that I had to ask a lot of questions where I felt stupid. I had already coached at the Olympics. I had already been to world championships, and I had to start to think through, like, what even happens when you do endurance-based training? Like, really simple questions that I just felt stupid asking. But as I started to dig deeper, I started to feel a little bit brighter, a little bit more intelligent. And so the first big aspect that I had to unlearn was that only weak athletes need endurance. And so what does that mean? Only weak, okay? Only weak athletes need endurance. In all reality, what that, to me at the time, when I started to really get into endurance-based training, was like, who are athletes that are weak? They're typically going to be a distance runner. Soccer players, stereotypically in my mind, are weak. An endurance cyclist. Even to a point, I had this idea that swimmers in general were pretty weak. Okay, and so I started to think through this, and especially when I started to work with more and more wrestlers, and we started to get athletes to, get third at the NCAA championships, or Nick Wazowski, who became a 2-time world bronze medalist, I started to realize, like, hey, when we started to work on Nick's endurance and we started to approach that a little differently, like, he did pretty well, and he was not a weak athlete. He was not a weak wrestler. Now, the next big factor is that we always see this meme of two individuals, one Dwayne Chambers, who actually tested positive for performance-enhancing drugs, and then another individual who's a Finnish either race walker or probably a marathoner of some sort. So that's sort of the meme that we see. Do you want to be a weak distance runner, or do you want to be, train like a sprinter? And the physiques just are incredibly contrasting, right? And so the thing there was, okay, now it's not just weak athletes, but in fact that endurance makes you weak. So now you're looking at it going like, all right, now endurance makes you weak. So endurance training makes you weak. And I wanted to sort of really think through that and go, okay, is this accurate? And at the time, when I started to really dive deeper into this, this is a really, really serious concept or discussion, because if I'm looking at a shot putter, we can't spare any time. We can't spare them getting weaker. If we have a discus thrower, they can't get weaker because they will break down. If someone is weak, they will break down. They will not have as much mobility, and in turn, they're gonna be more injured. So if we understand this, we need to avoid endurance, right? So that's like one of those big factors. Thinking through that false belief that endurance makes you weak, I really struggled with slowly adding in some type of endurance training, and started to study that and started to figure out, like, okay, are there examples of where you can improve endurance but then get stronger? Okay, and that takes us into that third one, which is going to be, you can't get strong and improve endurance at the same time. Okay, that's another big one that I think I had this thought process, and some of the coaches that I worked with early on were around. They were like, you can't increase size and strength at the same time. That was like a common thing. You can't get stronger and improve your endurance at the same time. But then there was this rise in CrossFit. And if I was to understand this, I would be watching, let's say, the CrossFit games, and then using the example, the image on the board here of Matt Frazier. So we would be watching Matt Frazier and think that he was improving his overall endurance, which we know that, if we were into the CrossFit world, we know that he spent every single morning on the rower for a half hour to an hour plus every single morning. And in the meantime, he was hitting PR back squats, PR cleans, PR power snatches, PR deadlifts. So he was getting stronger and he was improving his overall endurance. Now, in the realm of a normal kid, okay, so let's say we have a kid in high school. If this high schooler is going to become a swimmer, or he is a swimmer, or she's a swimmer, we need to focus on specific strength improvements. So let's say with a swimmer, improving their pull-up capability, right? So we want to get them to be better at doing pull-ups, while also ideally improving their endurance. Based off of my previous misconception, I didn't think this was possible. But if we could figure out a way to do this, it's possible. You can do it. It's actually feasible. You have to get creative, and you have to talk with the sport coach, and you have to work through different scenarios, but it is indeed possible. So you can get strong and improve in your endurance. And then another big one, okay, and I think this is this technical aspect here. I think this is really related to the misconception, probably caused by CrossFit, to be totally fair, is that athletes can't do technical things for endurance-based training. What does that mean? I think in all reality, this is rooted in the doing like a barbell cycling snatches, right? And you're doing like sets of 20, or we're looking at doing thrusters, which are somewhat technical movements. And we see CrossFitters doing them for absurd amounts of reps. And then we will place this blanket statement as a strength and conditioning coach, where we're like, nope, you either do your strength stuff, you do your technique stuff, you do your hypertrophy work, you do your endurance, and they're all separate. There can't be any crossover. There can't be any intermingling of those realms. When we do something like a technical aspect for endurance training, as a strength coach, I was under the impression or false belief that we 100% can't do anything technical. We shouldn't be doing snatches for sets of 20. We shouldn't be doing that. But there are definitely technical things that we can be doing and that we should actually be promoting as a strength coach, okay? And that's where having better conversations with our sport coach the individual who's actually instructing the athletes that we're working with, and even looking through like, hey, when we factor in this big picture model that we're going to present to you, when we build this out, I need to know how much endurance work you're actually doing in your specific sport. So if you're talking to a soccer coach, how much endurance work are you actually doing on the field? Okay, how much do you believe that you're going to be doing? And then we can start to look at some of the technical points in their sport and see if they're doing that for endurance training. And I'm going to use this example here, is that this is Tanner Sloan. Okay, so Tanner Sloan on the screen here, he ended up getting 2nd and 5th at NCAAs. Okay, so he's a 2-time All-American. One of the biggest things that I learned was going through wrestling training and understanding different modalities of endurance and how they have an impact on the heart, how they have an impact on improving energy systems or the effectiveness of different energy systems, is that wrestlers really like to do things like live drilling, or even going down further, a little bit easier endurance would be like sparring or flow wrestling. Okay, so sparring / flow wrestling is a type of technical movement in the sport specific to wrestling that you can do for 25 to 30 minutes. And you can use that to improve your endurance for your sport. So it's going to be a sport-specific endurance component, and it's going to be technically based. So we can improve endurance with technical components. Now, we also have to weigh risks and disadvantages and things like that to really work forward. Now, another one is that endurance negatively impacts recovery, especially when we're looking at like a power sport, is that we have to start to think about, what does endurance do? What do different types of endurance do to the body? And can we see a negative impact on recovery or not? And then recovery would be based around, if we think about a battery, okay, I'll use this as an example. We have a fully charged battery, right? If we do an endurance-based session for a thrower, in this case Sam Mattis, this is a picture from Tokyo when he made his first Olympic team. He actually just made his second Olympic team, but we take Sam. Okay, so he's got to be as strong, as explosive as possible. He's got to be very, very snappy. He's got to be really good in the circle, really technically sound. Let's say Sam has 100% on his battery. He does a squat workout or whatever. That goes down to 60%. He falls asleep, he goes to bed and wakes up at like 85. Well, let's say that Sam does that squat workout and then he does some type of endurance session. So like 20 minutes on an assault bike at a low intensity. Is he gonna wake up lower, or could he in theory wake up with a higher battery recharging? When we look at endurance negatively impacts recovery, it 100% can. I think one of the big issues I had with this false belief though was that all endurance leads to a negative impact on recovery. And so when that sort of awareness happened, I started to realize there's other forms of recovery that don't do that. There's forms of recovery that make you feel like absolute trash the next day, and I would not recommend it. But there's also modalities or forms of endurance that actually can increase your recovery. And if you experience them or you train them frequently over and over and over again, we can lead to an improvement in recovery, which will then enable us to squat more, to clean more, to jerk more, to snatch more, to bench more, and lead to overall success. And that's even similar to then going into the idea that running and puking aren't the only ways to get more endurance. I had thought all along, like, okay, we have to go out and run 10 miles if we want to improve endurance. The only way you're going to actually improve endurance or get the right adaptation is if you are puking. Okay, so if you're out there throwing up, and I still remember myself individually in college training on Fridays, and the old modality or thought process was that throwers in the fall would do a lot of bodybuilding and we would do a lot of running. We would actually go, my freshman year, we were running every Friday. We would go out for a 4 to 5 mile run. Still like at the tail end of that thought process. And even to the point where we would start to run hills, and multiple times I would throw up from running hills and eating too much for lunch, so I would end up puking. And in my mind, running and puking were the only ways to really improve your endurance, so I tried to shy away from that because I didn't want to deal with that. Fast forward 20 to 25 years later, I'm in a conversation with Olympic champion Daniel Stahl and his coach, and they're both talking about how every single morning Daniel would wake up and go for about an hour to an hour and a half walk. And so he would go out for this walk to improve his endurance in the circle. Because if he could increase his heart rate just a little bit, one, he'd get a nice sweat going in the morning. He wouldn't feel as lazy. He would feel a little bit more rejuvenation. He would get some sunlight. He would go through his thought process. It was a form of almost meditation. And then also he would increase his endurance, and in turn, he would be able to take more reps. So we could see that running and puking aren't the only ways. Okay, that's a pretty simple one, but then finally, this also does lead into what does endurance do for the mind, okay? And I think that when you're talking to endurance-based athletes and strength-based athletes as well, I think that we tend to see, a strength-based individual will just talk entirely about like getting under the bar, going to hit a big back squat. Let's say you do a set of 20 back squats and it's like you enter into this black world and everything, you just sort of like have tunnel vision and you're blocking everything out and you're just getting into the groove and you're not thinking about anything, you're just executing it. So we always thought like bodybuilding, getting that pump, right? That's the easiest way to train the mind. And that's why a lot of us in this room in this presentation, that's why we like lifting so much, is that it was helping us to get our mind at peace. Now, going back to one of my favorite quotes from Confucius is that silence is a true friend who never betrays. And I think that that was something that I ended up learning tremendously as I went through my journey of being a shot putter and then getting into marathon-based training, something that I wanted to get into to really understand the world of performance in endurance, was that I wanted to see what would happen in my head. Okay, I wanted to see when I was doing interval training, how big of a baby was I, right? What am I going to be doing? Can I silence my mind and just let myself go out for that harder interval run? Or if I went and ran 15 miles, what would end up happening to my brain, to my mindset as I was working through all this different progress? I think that that's where we tend to lead into, is that we want to just go through this mindset of like, if I was training to run the marathon originally, based off my misconceptions, I would have just thought, I'm gonna go squat more. Okay, if I squat more, I'm gonna be able to execute and run a marathon better. That's based off my false beliefs, my misconceptions. But instead, once I started to think through, how can I silence my mind? How can I really work through these longer runs that are going to be pretty hard, or even the interval work that might be 20 to 30 minutes of hard, high intensity interval training? How can I silence my brain and then in turn improve my overall endurance? And that leads us into basically having two ends of the spectrum. Is, as a strength coach, we've always sort of felt like, okay, we've got this end where it's like, look, if you're playing your sport, if you're wrestling, if you're playing soccer, if you're playing football, that's enough for you to improve your endurance. You don't need much more. Or we have on this end like, hey, we're gonna do endurance work in our sport. We're gonna make kids run and we're gonna make them throw up and we're gonna make them feel like absolute trash. And in all reality, that's essentially where we've been as strength coaches. We're on basically those two simple ends. And I think a lot of this stems back to, we read the research, we go through everything, we have our preconceived notions, we have social media, we have everything that we could ever imagine, but we're so rooted in this very specific niche of just strength training and lifting weights that it's hard to think through what endurance actually is. So in part 2 of this, we're gonna go deeper into what endurance is, how endurance matters, but in all reality, we have to unlearn. More people need endurance than just weak athletes. We also have to unlearn that endurance can have a positive impact on our strength, and that we don't need to unlearn that, but also we need to accept that you can get strong and improve endurance if you're creative. You can do technical things and improve your endurance, and that endurance does actually have a positive impact on training and on recovery, and you don't need to just run and puke to do that endurance-based training. You can actually do other things outside of running and puking, okay? And then finally, we also need to understand and accept that there's different forms of endurance that have a tremendously positive impact on your mind in leading to greater efficacy of sports performance. So if you guys want help with your training, you want help with your endurance, head over to peakstrength.app. We just started to implement brand new programming around endurance-based training for all sports into Peak Strength. Because remember, freaks, if you want to become a champion, you've always got to cultivate your power. Peace.